Imagine yourself in a spaceship millions of miles from Earth. You see the same people every day. The Earth, with all that it means to you, is just another bright star in the heavens. You aren't sure you'll ever get back to it.
Y podlediad rhyngwladol. Archwilio gofod bydd pawb. Eich gwesteion yn Lloegr ar Iseldiroedd. Matt Hewr a Julio Aprea.
Oh yeah, baby, Werner Von Braun.
Yeah, what is there to say that has not been said about Werner Von Braun?
He really did have an amazing life.
Yeah.
Very interesting life.
Interesting life, to say the least.
He saw it all, didn't he, really?
Yeah. But we're going to be talking about Werner Von Braun for quite a bit today, Matt. So before we go to the second most important person we're going to be talking about today, how are you doing?
I'm good. Thanks, Julio. Yes, we should explain that this episode is where we take the human missions to Mars all seriously, right?
Yeah, right. During this Mars month.
Do you know what is extraordinary about Mars month is that virtually everyone that has something to do with Mars, including Schiaparelli, and what day was Werner von Braun born on?
He was born on the 23rd of March.
He was, and I know that because 23rd of March is George's birthday as well. It's also the day that lockdown started in Britain. So we're almost coming up to a whole year of that. But yeah, Werner von Braun, also a March person. Isn't that weird? So many Mars coincidences.
There must be something special about it.
Yeah.
Right?
It is.
Only 1 every 12 people are born in March.
Yeah, that's
very special people.
Which makes me think that astrology must be true.
By the way, I'm sure someone will start thinking, I know, but you have to count the number of days in the month, and then, so it's not only 1 in 12 exactly. I was being sloppy there.
It's a bit like that thing about Mercury being the closest planet to Earth on average. Did you know that?
How is that, Matt?
Well, because it's got a much faster orbit than all the other planets. Mars spends a long time the other side of the sun, as does Venus, whereas Mercury keeps coming round and getting close to being on the right side, you see. So on average, it's the closest planet to all planets.
So you have done this calculation yourself?
I haven't. No, it's a recent calculation that someone did, and everyone was like quite shocked by the fact that Mercury is the closest planet.
I'm just teasing you.
Oh yeah, I'd never be able to do that. I don't even know where to start.
Anyway, so
yes. I think he doesn't start with von Braun though. I think we should quickly go over a little bit of the history leading up to von Braun.
Sure, although he was quite early on.
Well, I suppose he's one of two, isn't he? Robert Goddard, after reading H.G. Wells, actually thought to himself, I want to build rockets that go to Mars. And he actually climbed his cherry tree, and cherry trees seems to be cherry trees appear quite a lot in American history. He said, I imagined how wonderful it would be to make some device which had even the possibility of ascending to Mars. When I descended the tree, existence at last seemed very purposive.
Have you ever wondered how many people probably thought about going to Mars back then?
I don't think many.
So it's not so much who thinks about it, but who writes it down.
Yeah, who writes it down, who does something about it. To be fair, Robert Goddard did do something about it. And at the same time, a European writer called Kurt Larswitz, he inspired Werner von Braun and Walter Hohmann. And Werner von Braun asked himself, how do you get up there? Werner von Braun really is the first person to write it all down, isn't he? Write down a serious mission to Mars.
Von Braun, born in March, as you said, in 1912 in Germany. Okay, there's a lot said and written of this period of his life, all the way up to when he goes to the United States. I just want to mention that in 1930 he joined the Spaceflight Society.
The wären für Raumschifffahrt.
Wow. That sounded perfect for my knowledge of German.
I reckon that's pretty spot on.
Yeah, indeed. But I wanted to mention this because during the interview of this episode, which is where we talk about the British Interplanetary Society, Chris mentions that the BIS is the oldest still active space advocacy group, right?
But this one was the oldest.
Yes.
This is the very first, isn't it? The Verein für Raumschifffahrt is the oldest of all the space societies.
It was founded in 1927.
Which is 6 years before the British Interplanetary Society.
Yeah.
It was the model. It was the model for the British Interplanetary Society, as in they looked at it and said, "Oh, this seems like a good idea."
Von Braun was part of it. He was not one of the founders, actually. He joined it interested in the topic. We can say that Werner Von Braun is one or maybe even the most influential figure in terms of the history of planning missions to Mars, right? He wrote one of the very first technical designs or technical definitions of what a Mars mission would be, a crewed Mars mission would be.
He's the Elvis Presley of space. He's the true rock star, isn't he?
Yeah, indeed. So we chose to, as part of this episode, right? We said, okay, let's look at the different architectures of how to go to Mars. And today we're going to focus on two very particular ones. One is the Von Braun approach, and later on we will focus on the Zubrin approach, right?
The Zubrin approach.
Which are, obviously, there are similarities and also big difference between both, but we also have to take into account the different time period. The architecture by Von Braun evolved during his lifetime, of course. He started with a certain definition, and then over time he improved it and streamlined it and took advantage of new discoveries in space. But for the purpose of this episode, I thought, let's focus on the early ones. I think it's fun to see the way of thinking back in the day.
What I like about it, actually, is when you see people like Werner von Braun or even Zubrin, when they do the maths, they realize just how incredibly difficult it is.
Yes, indeed. And the numbers are staggering.
Your numbers are ridiculous.
Yeah. So back in 1949, he writes a novel called Project Mars, A Technical Tale. What is interesting is that even though this was written in 1949, it was published only in 2006 in English. The original German version was never published. However, that novel contains a technical appendix. That technical appendix was published in 1952 in German and then in 1953 in English. And this appendix alone, just the appendix of his novel, is the technical design of the human mission to Mars and quoted as the most influential book on planning human missions to Mars. He wrote the most influential book on planning human missions to Mars as an annex to his book. A book within the book.
Yeah, it's actually incredible.
Yeah. So based on that, Von Braun always realized early on the importance of popular support to carry these projects, right? He believed that you needed government support to carry these missions, and to have a government support in your projects, you need the people that elect that government to support you. So he was a big believer in communications, in outreach, and in popularizing these topics. So also he was part of a series of articles for Collier's on different topics on space. In particular, there is one on how to get to Mars that describes this mission, but let's say for a regular person of the time. This was published in 1954. And I have to say, this series of articles have some really, really cool illustrations. For those that have never seen them, maybe we should include a link on the notes because it has some of the best illustrations I have seen.
Yeah, brilliant. They were some of the illustrations they had as the original artwork at the London Design Museum, and they're absolutely amazing. But yeah, just so anyone doesn't know what Collier's was, Collier's had 3 million readers. It was a magazine, like a monthly magazine, 3 million readers. So it was, that was popular back then.
Yeah, quite.
That's like
massive,
like
massive
YouTube.
readership.
It's like,
and like I said, Von Braun was probably one of the most known people in the space projects of the time, right? In the US, really, really popular by name. Everyone knew him.
Yeah, I mean, he still hadn't done his greatest mission yet, though, had he?
No,
he still
but early on,
Apollo,
like you see, it's funny. He was so clever about self-promotion and outreach and the public. He was a science communicator as well, on top of being the most important engineer for the Americans.
He's very charismatic.
Extremely.
When you see him on television, you go, wow, yeah. I mean, he's got a certain magnetism, definitely.
And by the way, for those that want to see him on TV, now that everyone seems to have Disney Plus, there is this video called Man in Space. And this is a collection of different shorts that Disney made in partnership with Von Braun, with Willy Ley in 1955. I rewatched it again. I had to have watched this when I was a kid, and then this is clearly not the time, but I watched it again with let's say fresh eyes, a new view, and it's amazing that this was done in 1955. Remember that Sputnik does not happen until 1957.
Yeah,
The amount of knowledge that there is so much that they don't know, and yet so much that they can think about.
Yeah, no one had been into space. It's incredible, isn't it?
Exactly.
Nothing gone into space.
Not even satellites. Satellites were not even proven yet. Obviously, they were ideas or projects already ongoing, but there was no Sputnik yet.
I say nothing had been into space. Of course, I'm wrong. The only thing that had really been into space, of course, is V2 rockets.
Technically, yes. You're right. It never reached orbit, but it would
suborbital.
reach space.
Yeah, suborbital, though, yeah. My dad used to watch them going over his house as they went towards London, obviously.
He was watching history. For those listeners, just go watch it. You have Von Braun talking about his rockets with toy models and Willy Ley, and the depiction as well is so politically incorrect.
Let's work our way through the actual plan, because it's pretty great, isn't it?
The actual plan, yes, his plan is go big. Let's say he was inspired by polar expeditions. That, as you know, is particular topic of interest for myself as well. So you could say it's sort of the opposite to Subrin. Subrin wants to go direct with like the smallest mission you can accomplish. This is a big one. But also, for his time, this is what he thought was the minimum. Later in his life, he distills this mission definition and makes it much smaller and still feasible, according to his calculations, okay?
Both Zubrin and Von Braun continually mess around, don't they, with their particular architecture, but you have this starting point that is the reference mission.
Exactly. But you will not write it perfect the first time. Of course, you can keep improving. Like any artist, you're never done with your...
But it's a really great piece of insight, isn't it? The Von Braun one about looking at how people did things in the past, like Columbus or something like that. And would you try and cross the Atlantic in one ship? No, you wouldn't. No way, because it's just too dangerous. So you would try and think, right, you'd go in a flotilla of ships.
From day one, he's thinking about redundancy.
Yeah.
Again, go big, okay? For him, interplanetary exploration only could be done on a grand scale. So the reference period, as you said, for this particular architecture, we're talking about 1954, before Sputnik. And let's talk about the architecture itself, as you said. This is a mission that would take 2.5 years, 8 months of travel direction in each way, so to Mars and back to Mars, and then around 15 months in orbit of Mars, depending then on how long you take to land and set up your camp, but about 15 months on Mars. The travel distance, which for us Europeans, 571.3 million kilometers, we are thinking this is a Hohmann transfer orbit that he would follow, and it would be composed of 70 crew.
70 crew.
70 crew for the first mission to Mars. These people, that they would go on 10, as I'm quoting him, 10 massive spaceships. They would be 4,000 tons each. Okay? Now, picture the time, not even picture the time, picture 20 years later when you have the Saturn V launching. The Saturn V was 140 tons per launch to low Earth orbit. So just to get one of these ships, you needed 29 Saturn V launches. Now, times 10, times whatever extra you need to, I don't know, tools for assembly or just personnel going up and down. At least minimum 300 Saturn V launches for this mission.
It's definitely ambitious.
Yeah.
Let's go with that.
So out of these 10 ships, okay, as you said, a flotilla of ships, he does not think that you can go on one ship alone. You need this sort of redundancy. 3 of them, at least parts of them, are the ones that will actually land on Mars. But I'll get to that later, okay? He focuses on chemical propulsion, and he focuses on carrying everything. There is no concept of in situ resource utilization or ISRU at the moment in his paper. Then he follows, launch to low Earth orbit, assembly in orbit of these spaceships, and then you go all together to Mars. When you get to Mars, first you achieve orbit, and then some of those ships will land, as we will go in details, because he acknowledges then, of course, and this is clearly his expertise, within his architecture, he acknowledges that it really would not make no sense to have everything landing and then launching back to Earth, right? So you stay in orbit in Mars.
Yeah. Well, I'm gonna put some numbers to your things. Yeah, 5,320,000 tons of propellant in total that he needs to get up to actually make this mission work. And he actually puts in the paper that is 10% of the equivalent quantity of aviation fuel that was used in the 6 months of the Berlin airlift. So 10 times the fuel, used in 6 months of one of the biggest operations of all time.
No, it's insane. Again, the scale, it's very difficult to get a sense of the scale of such a mission.
Yeah. I mean, it's mad, and
it's mad, but at the same time, this is what he's not saying. This is something we can do today. He's saying this is a mission that could happen 100 years from now.
Yeah,
2054, which by the way is not too far from now.
Yeah,
but this is what he thinks can be achieved in 100 years. In between, we had many people. How many times the mission to Mars has been planned for 2030?
Oh yeah, just loads and loads. Well, the latest NASA paper, of course, had that mind-blowing revelation that under the present NASA scheme, you would need 10 SLS launches to launch the fuel for it. 10 SLS launches to launch just the fuel for the mission. And that's when you had favorable conditions.
So again, the scale and SLS would launch how many times a year?
Well, you're lucky if it's once, yeah. So I mean, it's not going to happen. In other words,
how much if you take 10 years just to launch the fuel? Okay, let's go back to Werner.
But he's already. What I love about it, he's already he's sort of hitting the problems that are forever going to snag this trip to Mars.
Exactly. He says, okay, his approach is, okay, there are some things we know. There are lots of things that we don't know. It does not mean that we cannot talk about those problems today, and we can identify what things we don't know, because this is how you do science, right? You identify what you don't know, and then you can carry on research specifically on those topics. So, but I'm going to go into that a little bit later. First, just to complete the architecture of the mission, okay, we are going in this flotilla of 10 massive spaceships to Mars. We are in orbit. And as I told you before, 3 of those ships are special. Parts of them are the ones that will actually land. So first you take one of those ships that will have a sort of torpedo nose cone, okay? That torpedo nose cone becomes the fuselage of your plane that will land on Mars. You will attach huge wings and skis. Why is that? First of all, the huge wings, at the time, they did really not know how thin the atmosphere was. So they thought you could glide into Mars. And the skis, because he was thinking that at the polar caps was the only place where you could have a smooth enough surface to land. So he sends this first crew of, if I remember correctly, 7 people to land at the poles. And then they have to, let's say, strip this plane, take the parts that they need, and travel by land 6,400 kilometers to the equator. No highways, by the way.
Yeah, but the equator bit is that they've already scoped that out from orbit, haven't they? So from orbit, they've used a telescope to select a site for the base camp.
But they need to land at the polar caps.
But the reason why they land at the polar caps is because Werner von Braun's made the assumption that it will be icy and therefore more likely to be smooth. Exactly.
Just imagine crossing this land of 6,400 kilometers. They have to do some proper mapping first.
Well, the crazy thing, they'd be the first people to see Mars. So this would be the first time you'd go, oh, this is what we're dealing with.
Yeah.
Because there's no telescope powerful enough to see it.
Even in this paper, he mentions how the atmosphere blurs what you can see with a telescope. So he's not even... This guy is thinking about human missions to Mars, but he's not thinking of satellites that can map Mars in advance. He goes a little bit into that later on. But okay, you have now this crew traveling this immense distance to the equator.
What's it, 4,000 miles?
4,000 miles or 6,400 kilometers. This first rocket plane they used, they abandon it in the polar caps. They get to the equator and they have to build a base and they have to build a runway. Where in this runway, the other two rocket planes with the rest of the crew can land.
But they've got wheels, haven't they? The other ones have got wheels.
The other ones would have wheels, indeed.
Yeah.
Indeed. And I indeed, you sort of, if you're building a runway with whatever you have on Mars, you are doing in situ resource utilization in a way. But what I meant before was for like rocket fuel and food and air. Anyway, now you spend 15 months or a little bit more than a year on Mars.
Well, the one bit I really like is as these wheeled craft land, the very first job is to take the wings off.
Yes.
And then hoist them upright so they look like V2 rockets ready to launch. As in, it's like get them ready for emergencies because all the time they're on the ground, you're stuffed. So the very first job is to get them ready to take off. That's the very first job that he thinks of. It's ace.
In his view, these rocket planes are also, you just remove the wings, you erect them, and there you have a rocket. I want to have one of these machines. I want these machines to exist.
Yeah, absolutely. Do they live in inflatable habitats? That's right, isn't it?
Yes, he mentioned some sort of inflatable habitats as well as protection.
I think that's massively forward thinking, isn't it? Thinking of inflatable habitats.
Yes, but there are many, many things that he was very forward thinking about. The guy, for those of us in the industry, what can you say about the guy? He's again, he's one of the most influential figures. He invented so many things.
But there are other things going on around the world as well. I mean, he's not maybe on his own, because over in the BIS, and this is something that I mentioned in the interview, is that that Shepard and Val Cleaver of the BIS, had written the first unclassified nuclear mission to Mars, so using nuclear propulsion to get to Mars. I don't think they'd sort of fleshed out the entire architecture, but that was 1948.
Yes, and what is funny is that in this paper, he mentions a new propellant that would make the trip much shorter, but he does not mention what it is.
Oh, well,
I could assume he's hinting at nuclear propulsion.
Because Arthur C. Clarke writes Sands of Mars as well, 1951, which uses, and the most ridiculous thing is, it uses a rocket called the Ares.
Yeah,
which is like, which presumably is one of the very first mentions of it, but it just keeps, Ares just keeps getting.
Yeah, but God of War, Mars.
I know,
the other name.
I know, but it's
obvious.
But everyone just doesn't give it up. But Arthur C. Clarke has sort of outlined a sort of architecture in the book Sands of Mars. So it's not like Werner von Braun's completely out of the blue. We got to put that into some kind of perspective.
No, as we said, we talk about the different space societies around the world popping up. Lots of interest in the topic of rocketry and going to space. I mean, von Braun becomes this figure behind the human spaceflight in the US, the missions to the moon. I guess also part of that is why we revere the guy so much. Okay.
Yeah.
But in going back to this 1954, where I think there is the guy goes for this grand scale of a mission, but at the same time, I find him quite humble, because he says, this is going to happen in 100 years from now. There are, I don't know, the majority of the things I don't know, but I count on these 100 years of research, of science, to discover and help. He's saying most of the ideas that I will describe here today are probably going to be obsolete by the time this happens. But this still today we can talk about it. We can talk about the problems we have today. And he then the focus on these papers on man, and again in these days of politically correctness, the guy just uses man. So for the purpose of this episode, I'm using man instead of crew. Okay, but he says man is the weakest link, and there is a lot of focus on the unknowns in medicine and psychology connected to a mission like this to Mars, for the length of the stay, for the isolation. He mentions muscle atrophy. He proposes spring exercise machines, as we have in the ISS. He proposes synthetic gravity, so rotating the spacecraft to create a centrifugal force and create a artificial gravity. I love synthetic gravity. I think I will start using it instead of saying artificial gravity. I will start using this one.
Synthetic gravity, yeah. Nice. Do you want to know what the top 4 risks are going to Mars? Because he's nailed most of them in that paper, but still NASA, the top 4 red risks, as in mission-ending risks, are radiation,
yes.
Radiation, cancer, cardiovascular disease, and cognitive, and cognitive disability, all caused by radiation. Right, so like that is a nightmare. Then you've got neuroocular syndrome, which is that thing you start to go blind, basically, which is a massive problem on the ISS. Then you've got behavioural health and performance decreasing, because massive, and of course food and nutrition. They're the 4 still red risks for going to Mars that remain unsolved.
Some of them.
And he's nailed pretty much all of them there, really, apart from the ones that he didn't know about.
Yeah, food not so much, but he focuses on for instance, we're talking about psychology and behavior. He acknowledges that the crew needs to be entertained if you don't want them to kill each other. He mentions the psychology and the need to entertain the crew and the importance of selecting the right crew. According to him, 1 in 6,000 people would be qualified for this trip. Yeah, physical attributes, mental attributes, emotional attributes. This is not yet counting education. So 1 in 6,000, you still need them to be an engineer or scientist or something. Again, the entertainment is big for him because he says you're going to be confined with this for these long periods with all these people. The minor things of every day will just get on your head. And he mentions that this could lead to hatred that could lead to murder. He was not sugarcoating anything here.
No, well, he's absolutely right. And of course, there is experience of that, isn't there? When you've got things like the mutiny on the Bounty had only been like 100 years earlier or something like that. And you think, yeah, so there is a precedence for that. But I love that insight again of you've got to take lots of people because there is no help from home. So you have to take doctors, you have to take engineers, yes. You have to take farmers, you basically have to take everyone because you're kind of stuffed unless you have everyone there. So you have to have, how many people was it again? You have 70.
70 crew. But also when he mentions, okay, you mentioned radiation, he proposes to surround the cabin crews in the fuel tanks, with fuel tanks as a sort of radiation protection. I just think of what if you have a fuel leak? But okay, this particular design has been mentioned over and over again in other architectures to surround the crew with, the water tanks or propellant tanks. And he actually hopes for these 100 years that there is a sort of development of a radiation pill that would protect you from the dangers of radiation, which is pretty much what you get in The Expanse.
They are trying to develop those kind of pills. And of course, you could even go down the whole CRISPR, genetically engineer people to be less susceptible to radiation, illness.
But basically, you need something able to repair your DNA, or at least something. If you have that pill for space travel, you also have the cure for cancer.
That might be one of the sort of upsides of COVID, but that's another story altogether.
He says that this is one of the many reasons to have the multiple ships. He almost counts that at least one of those ships will have to be abandoned because of the meteorite strike.
Wow.
And he mentions the different engineering problems you could have, that you have 2 black holes, which made me think of the ISS. But also these meteorites, he describes them as bullets. So all these engineering problems coming from it. But I'm sure he's also thinking, yes, and some people are going to die here. You're talking about bullets going through the cabin crews. And another reason to have 70 people. He's not saying it in so many words, but the guy is probably thinking that a few will die.
Yeah, so not only do you need to take 1 doctor, you need to take 3 doctors because the likelihoods are 2 of them might die on the journey, and you definitely need a doctor regardless. So, hence the 70 people, isn't it? Which is, like you said, it's based on Antarctic expeditions of the day. So the Operation High Jump, for example, was 4,000 men, 13 ships, 23 aircraft. So,
if you need 4,000 men, okay, that's a lot of redundancy. When you narrow it down to 70, it sounds like a lot for our current space missions.
Yeah.
But it's really a major.
But coming out of that sort of larger exploration goals, you suddenly realize, no, actually, that would have been maybe back then, it's easier to think of these larger numbers because that's how we were exploring the world.
And I have the impression that what is today, okay, our biggest problem today for achieving something like this, cost of launch, right? We seem to be going in the right direction, but it's still today the cost of launch. I don't know how much this was present back then how much it really costs to launch this amount of
Do you know what?
mass.
I tell you what's funny, that I've round about the same time, and again, Chris mentions this. Arthur C. Clarke wrote a bunch of articles, and one of the things he mentions is that it's always going to be insanely expensive. So he actually predicts, and this is one of the most remarkable predictions as far as I'm concerned or aware of. He predicts that yes, we'll go to the moon, but it'll be so insanely expensive, we'll do it a couple of times, and then we won't do it for another 50 years. And it's like, wow, he's pretty much exactly guessed what was going to happen.
Arthur C. Clarke.
Yeah. And it's like, because, I think they did, maybe not then, but a little bit later, way before they actually went to the moon, they had realised that this is unbelievably expensive and unbelievably difficult. You know, the rocket equation had been around for a long time at this point.
Yeah.
And that's really, there is no getting around it, is there? It is the tyranny of the rocket equation.
At the same time, there was the hope of new propellants being discovered that would improve that.
Well, yeah, that's the sort of, I mean, the nuclear was,
the future.
The nuclear thing was on the horizon, I suppose.
And just to, I found two little things about this proposal from Von Braun from back in the day. Well, he also thinks about the cleanliness of the air. That's very important. But what's funny is that he thinks that the distance will be too far for a TV signal. Too far from that. And this is that case in which you have these people thinking about traveling to other planets and having this massive cruise, and things that will at the end of the day evolve much, much slower than they expected. And yet these everyday things like TV, they think it will be much harder to develop.
Well, I mean, it's amazing, isn't it? So 52, he's saying, it's going to be impossible. Because he even said it about Earth to moon missions as well. He said, TV, forget about it. It's just going to be impractical. Yet it's
now we have videos of landings on Mars.
It's only 16 years later that Neil Armstrong is having his footage delivered live to 500 million people. And you think that is an amazing... that's the age of the television. I suppose we've just lived through the age of the internet where a similar sort of thing's happened, doesn't it, really?
Indeed. He also, he assumes that all entertainment will come via radio, and he recommends that the radio is censored, because he says, what if something happens to the town of one of the crew members or the family of one of the crew members? You do not want that information to reach that person because it could affect the mission. It's sort of cruel in a way. But that's a way of thinking back in the day, I guess.
Yeah, well, they have some protocols like that, don't they? Still.
I don't know what the protocols. That's a very interesting question. Very interesting question.
Yeah.
Anyway, just to finish with him. So he's saying we're going to do this 100 years from now, so in the 2050s. So he also mentions hibernation. At that time, they are still starting to experiment, especially in France, with reducing the body temperature for certain surgical operations. Even then, he even hinting at that, he's already thinking, if I can hibernate people, less food, less muscle atrophy, they are in top shape when we get to Mars. But okay, this is 100 years from now. We'll see.
The one that I really like is by the time we get to 1975, so Von Braun's obviously had his major success of Apollo.
His 15 minutes of fame.
He's definitely had his 15 minutes of fame, but he's had Apollo success. And he then goes on to discuss how you could use the space shuttle, reconfigure it, and nuclear thermal rocket engines on a couple of spacecraft to get them over to Mars as part of this Mars project. So he's always kind of building on this Mars project, and that by 1975 he's abandoned chemical propulsion in favor of nuclear propulsion.
Indeed.
I think NASA are about to pivot again to nuclear propulsion after that 10 launches of SLSs just to get the fuel.
On that, we have to wait and see. What are the latest developments on that? We're definitely not working on at least on the ESA side, we're not working on full force on developing nuclear propulsion.
Yeah, it doesn't look as though anyone is. I think it's been abandoned, hasn't it? But NASA have gone back into thinking about it because that in one of these latest papers about getting to Mars, it's hey, we really need to look at nuclear propulsion again.
But these concepts are never fully abandoned. You always have some study in advanced concepts. Some funding always go, but obviously it always depends on the level of funding you want to put and how much you want to accelerate the research on that.
Yeah, I know, absolutely. It's definitely something that's interesting. I mean, the UK government, I know, are putting money into Rolls-Royce to develop nuclear engines. So that, people are looking at it again. Von Braun he's absolutely smashed it out the park, hasn't he, with Das Mars Project.
Yeah, and like I said, he obviously, for the rest of his life, he streamlined, he perfected his plan. There are many newer versions. I was just focused on the one of the early 1950s because he was fun.
It's the yardstick.
Yes.
It's the one that everyone really sort of goes back to. And at the end of the day, his entire career, just in echoed with Elon Musk as well, isn't it?
That's the end game. Yeah.
Okay, Mars is the end game for Von Braun. After Von Braun, of course, there was quite a lot of these things coming up. Russians did one, the Martian piloted complex, Bono Mars, the NASA Lewis Mars, the TMK-2. There was an interesting one by Robert L. Stahl called An Expedition to Mars Employing Shuttle-Era Systems, Solar Sail and Aero Capture. That was 1982. And what I thought was incredible about that is it was a crew size of 8, but it required 53 space shuttle launches.
Remind me the lift capacity of the shuttle. 27 tons. Compared to the rockets in operation today, it's big, but not as big as the super heavies we're working on now. Or the Saturn V.
Yeah, the Saturn V.
27 tons compared to the Saturn V that we said before was 140.
Yeah, but remember, if you're talking about space shuttle systems, if you take the orbiter off and you design a new cargo version.
Okay. So this version was focused on not using the orbiter.
Actually, a bit like SLS.
Like the Energia.
Yeah, like Energia, but more like SLS because you're using the advanced solid propellers.
Solid propellant boosters. Yeah.
So I think that's kind of what it was based on. I'm assuming because it's 1.3 million tons he's got to get up there in that particular.
Yeah, you have the Energia at around 100 tons as well.
Yeah.
Because also with the shuttle, the central tank, you don't have an engine there.
No, exactly.
So you would have to add the engine.
Yeah, well, that's why the Russian system was better. Really, Energia is still one of the greatest rockets ever built. Boosters.
It's a tragic story.
But it was the fall of the Soviet Union, wasn't it? Really, and then it was all lost. The big thing in this one was Mariner 4, and this is something we said a couple of episodes ago. 1964 showed that Mars was this cold desert world, and I think from that point onwards, no one was in that much of a rush to go to Mars anymore. And so by 1969, despite Spiro Agnew's Space Task Force, they decided, no, let's abandon Mars. And that was kind of like a proper NASA decision. But over the years, people realized that Mars, even though it was a desert, potentially could have had life on it. So you started getting NASA interested in sending robotic missions there to look for water. And then you had sci-fi writers like Kim Stanley Robinson writing about going there to sort of, reigniting the kind of trip to Mars. So by
Red Mars, Blue Mars, Green Mars. Yeah. Such a good read.
Amazing. And really, really good outline of how to do it using space shuttles again, weirdly, and nuclear propulsion. But 1990, George Bush made the Space Exploration Initiative in 1989, the Space Exploration Initiative by George H.W. Bush. And it was to, get people back to Mars. And NASA did a 90-day study and created this enormous plan, which Zubrin described as Battlestar Galactica. In other words, what NASA seemed to be doing was trying to use every single piece of technology they could to get to Mars. And as far as Zubrin was concerned, this was like what engineers shouldn't be doing. As in, that's not what an engineer does. An engineer tries to look at the problem.
Work in the simplest way possible.
Simplest way possible.
With the smallest amount of risk.
So
by the simplicity of the technology that you choose. Yes.
Zubrin obviously came up with Mars Direct 1990 as a direct response to this 90-day study that NASA had done, which was a direct response to Bush's Space Exploration Initiative, 1989. And Zubrin reckoned Mars Direct would 9% the cost of NASA's design. And the breakthrough in the Zubrin one, which I think is the breakthrough, I think this is the thinking nowadays, isn't it? That you would use ISRU, in situ resource utilization, to manufacture rocket propellant. Now, it's almost certain that he got that idea, again, from the Journal of the British Interplanetary Society, from a paper by James French that was published in 1989, where it basically used the Sabatier process to make methane, I believe, on Mars. Zubrin's one, again, is one of those ones now, has very much become the kind of touchstone, hasn't it, the Mars Direct?
When you talk about different architectures, yes, definitely one of the better known ones, right?
Yeah, but I think he hit it at the wrong time. This is like 1990, but Dan Goldin of NASA, who was the administrator in 1992, basically abandoned human exploration beyond Earth orbit.
Well, that was the age of faster, better, cheaper.
Yeah. And it was just like, we're just going to go. We're going to go with robots to Mars and everywhere else, which in some ways has been amazing. You know, we've got Perseverance and all those kind of things, but not great for Zubrin because he was convinced that this plan was going to work. So when he put this together, it was basically a longer surface stay. It was a faster flight because it's a conjunction class mission. It used in situ resource utilization. The craft would be launched directly from the surface of Earth to Mars as opposed to being assembled in orbit or by a space-based dry dock. He started putting this together and he worked for Martin Marietta, who basically said, okay, there's 12-man team. You go focus on this. And they put together this paper, which was so popular at the time. When they first read it out at the National Space Society, after going on a tour with it, it received a standing ovation. Kind of like Musk did with his BFR. You know, Zubrin and David Baker were becoming that kind of legendary status, I suppose.
Also controversial figures.
Oh, yeah.
Right.
I love Zubrin, though. I kind of like his his ludicrous persona. But
don't get me wrong. I love these sort of people.
Yeah.
If you don't have that, how many times these are the people that really move things forward?
Yeah, well, you've got to be a bit spiky, haven't you? You've got to be convinced that you're right. Otherwise, you're not going to push it. You're not going to push it.
If everyone is your friend, if you don't make any enemies, you're not moving forward.
Yeah.
You have to get someone pissed off. If you really have to move forward, if you really want to change things, by definition, you are bothering the status quo. That's how it is.
Yeah. He's for me, Zubrin is like the Alan Bond of America. He's
that's an interesting comparison.
We've had him on the podcast a couple of times, and it's been super fun.
Bond as well.
And Bond, yeah. I interviewed Bond and Zubrin on the same day, weirdly, once, which was good. It was a good day. Mission profile, then, for Zubrin's Mars Direct. The first launch, guess what the name of the rocket is?
Miss Piggy.
No, it's the Ares. Or Ares.
So close.
Again, it's a heavy lift booster, sort of like Saturn V, derived from the space shuttle components using the advanced solid rocket boosters, modified shuttle external tank, liquid hydrogen, liquid oxygen, third stage for trans-Mars injection, can put 121 tons into circular orbit and boost 47 tons towards Mars.
There you go. Still not a Saturn V.
Still not the Saturn V. So ERV, the Earth Return Vehicle, is what's going to be launched on that. So the upper stage comprises this living accommodation for the crew, which was going to be a 6-month return trip. So 6-month journey time. The lower stage containing rocket engines and a small chemical production plant, which we'll get onto in a minute. Once it's arrived, the ERV landed on Mars. It then spends the next 10 months using the Sabatier reaction, which is basically a chemical process that's been used for centuries on Earth. So they've pretty much nailed it as something that can be done. They would start making 112 tons of methane and oxygen using the hydrogen that they've carried and the carbon dioxide from the Martian atmosphere. So you would start making methane and oxygen, which of course is one of the reasons why Elon Musk has started making things like the Raptor engine, because it burns methane.
Mm-hmm.
Not the only reason. So 96 tons of the methane and oxygen would be needed to send the Earth Return Vehicle back.
And this is all with this first uncrewed.
Yeah. So this, yeah.
Everything has to be automatic.
So it's all completely automatic. The Earth Return Vehicle has gone all the way there, lands, makes its own fuel, and then once it's done all that, it sends. It makes 96 tons for the return journey, and the extra whatever it is, 20 tons is used for things like your surface stay. So things like Mars rovers and stuff like that you need to get about. Once it's done that, once it's created that fuel, it sends a signal back to Earth to say we're good to go to launch the next part, which is going to be 2 years, a little bit over 2 years after that first launch. You send the signal, the Mars Habitat Unit is what then gets launched. Again, 6-month journey. So that's a low energy transfer trajectory to Mars, the Hohmann transfer. And that's carrying 4 crew members, which is the minimum required, so that you've got 2 teams of 2, meaning that no one's ever left alone.
But here is where you end up having the problem of the disciplines.
Yeah.
Right?
You have to be multiple.
With only 4 people. Yeah. How if you were discussing before that you need 3 medical doctors.
Yeah, but remember that he's calling this really a lunar class mission. In other words, it's like, forget the Von Braun's epic missions to Mars. Let's just do it lunar class. So we know that.
Still, you're going to be more than a year.
Oh, yeah. You're
still going to be more than a year
But
away.
I think the difference is, I guess, is that he knows that these people can talk to the ground. Even though there's going to be delays,
True.
It's not like Von Braun, who just assume these people are on their own.
And telemedicine is a thing by now, by the way. So.
Exactly. So I think, it's still ambition. It's clearly massively dangerous.
But I still wonder, for these 4 people, then, what are the disciplines that you need? Do they have to be all pilot engineers and that's it?
Pilot engineers, and I think they'd be very similar to, with astronauts today, really.
Let's say some sort of medical training.
Yeah, that have been down the caves. They've done all that stuff.
These characters would put Neil Armstrong to shame.
Oh yeah, the whoever steps foot on Mars first.
Not because of the achievement. I'm just meaning you are not going for 14 days.
Oh, you're not going to be a fighter pilot, just a brave fighter pilot. You are. Well, I mean, it's ridiculous to call Neil Armstrong just a brave fighter pilot, but
that's understatement of the century. Yes.
But yeah, you're absolutely right. But that's like any discipline, isn't it? It's in the same way that sprinters are getting faster, chess players are getting better. You'd expect the people going to Mars to be of a different caliber to the people that went to the moon, because all the training methods are there. In virtually every discipline like that, people tend to have to be better, don't they?
Yeah, and we have done the test, obviously. Mars 500 be one of them. All these tests of long separation, small crews, so it should work.
Yeah. Oh, well, the one thing I love about this again is that he's thought about artificial gravity. So he tethers the habitat unit to the spent upper stage of the booster, and then they rotate around and give you a 1G working environment so that they don't have the long-term illness associated with weightlessness. The upper stage gets jettisoned as you approach Mars, and then the habitat unit aerobrakes into Mars and does a soft landing somewhere near that original Earth return vehicle. Now, I think they would have more than one Earth return vehicle, so that there's always a redundant vehicle somewhere on Mars. That's certainly the case in The Martian, and The Martian uses really the Mars Direct architecture as their...
Yeah, at the same time, what if you land on the wrong spot because you have to have some emergency maneuver?
There is a rover as part of this Mars Habitat unit. When you it's carrying scientific gear, it's carrying a small rover, it's carrying all the inflatable habitats that are required. So yeah, this is a big old thing, this habitat unit.
And you can see how Andy Weir really took lots of inspiration from this for The Martian, indeed.
Mars Direct appears in lots of films, books, and programs. The National Geographic Mars program they did is essentially Mars Direct as well.
If we said that Von Braun was the most influential architecture because of the time when it was written and everything, can we call Zubrin's the second most influential one?
I think it's vying for top spot. It's a bit like saying who's more influential out of Elvis and the Beatles.
No, I mean, for me, no questions that Von Braun is the most influential. Number one, it was there at the beginning, and it set the pace for everyone else. This one comes decades later. I'm just meaning with forgetting Von Braun.
But it kind of rips.
It is his number two.
But it rips Von Braun's up, doesn't it? It's like saying, actually, we need to think. I like Zubrin's because it's thinking beyond. The thing about people like Von Braun is that they are so influential, people stop thinking beyond what they have suggested. Whereas Zubrin is bold enough to go, oh, NASA, you've got it wrong, and Von Braun, you've got it wrong. This is how it should be done.
You know, this just made me think of something I was reading in Eric Berger's book, Liftoff, when he's talking about the part between rocket plane Kistler and his company, how the CEO was George Mueller, right? He was this big figure during the Apollo times. He was director of human spaceflight at NASA, right? There's a sort of parallel there.
Yeah. Well, there's lots of parallels everywhere. It's a bit like Isaac Newton. No one questions the laws of motion until Einstein comes along and goes, we're going to have to think differently, and then it's like, let's think differently about gravity. And everyone goes, oh my God, what have you done?
Sure, but Newton still works.
Newton still works, but
you're not thinking differently. I mean, you are you are thinking differently, but for the day-to-day uses, you still use Newton.
Newton's still the most influential scientist, or is he? Or is Einstein the most influential? I think it's almost silly, isn't it, to start comparing them? But I think Zubrin's currently is still the most feasible Mars journey, isn't it? If one journey was going to happen, it wouldn't be the Von Braun one.
No, of course you're not going to go with a flotilla of
why not?
10
I
ships.
don't know, of course. You see, there's another thing, isn't it? It's like at the moment,
I'm thinking of the realities of cost of launch. I'm thinking of the realities of political willingness. So, of course, things could change.
Well, that's it, isn't it? We know
I would
they
probably
do.
Eat my hat at some point, but still.
But we know they do, because you just look at the history of Mars, the way that people have been planning for the trip to Mars. It's always, it shifts and moves around, doesn't it? Sometimes it's rocket propulsion, sometimes it's nuclear propulsion, sometimes it's more ships, sometimes it's less ships, sometimes it's sometimes it's come back, sometimes it's conjunction, sometimes it's,
But for the idea of having to launch 300 Saturn V class of rockets in a relatively short time.
But that's what
to assemble.
But that's what Musk is doing,
everything.
though, isn't it? I mean, that's the whole point of Starship, for example, is that he needs that kind of cadence to make Starship make sense.
But I have such a hard time visualizing it. How you get to that level of cadence? You know, that how it's so many launches. Of course, 300 in the end, if you can do once a day, you're done in a year, you assemble everything and you can go. But it just seems so far away from our current reality.
Yeah.
I hope it happens. I really want this to happen. It's just, I don't know how to visualize it.
Every time we talk about trips to Mars and human trips to Mars, the moment you start scraping at the surface, you realise this really is the greatest undertaking that mankind has ever done. But then so was crossing the Atlantic. And so was going to Antarctica. And so was, building the Suez Canal. And so was, et cetera, et cetera.
The pyramids.
And the pyramids, yeah. And you think, what I love about people like Von Braun, Zubrin, etc., is that they're not daunted by the fact that this is just that this will be the biggest engineering project of all time. It's almost like that's what makes them want to do it.
Yeah, not because it is easy, but because it's hard.
Yeah.
Actually, Zubrin is trying to make it easier.
Yeah, I mean, Zubrin is trying to make it easier. And I think combined with, because Zubrin's done a sort of version of this where he uses Falcon Heavies. So you can you send 2 crew on a Falcon Heavy and you use Dragon as the habitat. And even NASA had worked out that Dragon was capable of landing on the Martian surface with fully propulsive landing on Mars. So it was all feasible.
But by now, Red Dragon is
cancelled, because to have the feet that popped out of the heat shield was just too difficult. But I don't know whether the Zubrin design actually relied on Red Dragon, or whether you would just use the parachutes and just have a slightly modified version that whacked down onto the ground instead of into the sea.
I don't know, with the history of landing on Mars,
it's
uncrewed spacecrafts.
Oh well, imagine doing it in a Starship for the first time with that crazy maneuver.
Sure, but with Starship, at least you would be landing propulsive.
Yeah. What would you like to land propulsive? If you're going to land, which one you've got? Wings, propulsion, or parachutes? Which one would you rather? I'd rather do wings myself, but then Mars is useless for that.
But the atmosphere is not dense enough.
So it's useless for that.
Forget the
parachutes or propulsion.
Propulsion.
Really?
Yeah.
Well, what's more what's less likely to work, a parachute or a rocket engine?
Yeah, I know that you have a good point, but it's the same as when flying, they tell you flying on a plane is safer than driving your car. But if I have propulsion, I feel more in control than if I have a parachute.
Yeah, it's a tough one. It's a tough one.
Would you like to have brakes on your car, or would you like to have a parachute behind your car?
I'd definitely rather have brakes on my car.
That's how I think about propulsion.
I can't help feeling that brakes are more reliable than restarting a rocket engine.
Oh, we're getting there.
We'll
get there.
I mean,
and probably you would have a combination of both, right?
Well, would you? Or you wouldn't have parachutes on Starship?
Not on Starship, but if you were landing with a capsule.
If you were going in a Dragon, yeah. But of course, I mean, SpaceX have got their Mars mission outlined on their website, which is basically launching boosters and landing a Starship on the Mars surface, which I think Zubrin doesn't particularly like, does he? Because he thinks it's too large a spaceship to land on the Mars surface. He thinks that it's a little bit wasteful. That you're better leaving it in orbit and going down with a smaller vehicle.
Yeah,
which I can understand the thinking behind that.
Oh, and Von Braun was of the same thinking.
I mean, I quite like the ones that use Phobos as a base, but I believe that's what they did in Red Mars in Kim Stanley Robinson. That you sort of get to Phobos and then that's your That's your launch down to the surface, and you have it as a base. Arthur C. Clarke did that as well.
Yeah, no, that is an interesting architecture. I'm just wondering why would the SpaceX one want to go direct instead of detaching from orbit?
Because it can.
I guess from the point of view of engineering, it's easier that when you're coming back, you don't need to do an in-orbit rendezvous, right?
Yeah, is the in-orbit rendezvous that difficult, though?
By now, as a species, we have done it. Still difficult.
Still difficult, but it seems to be quite routine now.
Yeah, but if you could remove it. Also, what do? You go to Mars, and if you leave that spacecraft in orbit, that is supposed to be your crew habitat for the way back, right?
But
But you're not going to leave anyone on board. They're not going to stay 1 year in orbit around Mars, right? I mean, maybe you have to leave a skeleton crew, but
it's even more wasteful when you get back to Earth. So if you then come back into Earth's atmosphere using a large rocket again, like the Starship, you've then got to get all that tonnage back out of Earth's gravity well. Whereas I've been starting to think about that thing that Eric brought up about using dragons to actually dock with starships in orbit. So you launch on a dragon, and then you get into a starship, go round the moon, get back out of it, and then land in a dragon.
Yeah, but I think he must be so confident in the reduction of the cost.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's it, isn't it? It's just, can you just keep reusing and reusing and reusing? And you have to have the booster reusing as well.
So if he's so confident that the cost goes down so much, instead of having to use Dragon capsules that then you have to refurbish, to reuse, and who knows, maybe he reaches a point in which just landing a Starship and launching it again is cheaper than a Falcon 9 with a Dragon capsule.
It's hard, isn't it?
Maybe it's a simplicity of architecture. There is a certain beauty to it. If you dramatically reduce the cost of access to space, as he wants to.
Well, I mean, that's it, isn't it? It's if he can reuse it and reuse it and reuse it, get a huge cadence going, get loads and loads and loads of stuff into orbit, then we're going to become an interplanetary species.
But to close on that, I still think that we're missing more in-orbit propellant production instead of launching all this propellant from our planet. In-orbit manufacturing of propellant, I think that's one of the keys to this. You could dramatically reduce the number of launches that you actually need to launch.
Yeah, or even if you had it on the moon.
Yes, indeed.
Or a near-Earth asteroid.
So, Matt, but we are not going to solve it here.
No,
right?
no,
These
no.
guys
Yes,
spend
no, yes.
decades.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, that's right.
Amount of resources. So whatever else happened to your mate Zubrin?
Well, Zubrin. So yes, we've got this Mars habitat unit that's landed, and just to give you an idea, it will kind of be a 3-deck vehicle. Or 2 to 3 deck vehicle. So you've got sleeping quarters, communal areas, galley kitchens, exercise areas. You've got all the things like closed cycle water purification. You've got working spaces for science and stuff like that, storage spaces, airlocks so that you can go out and actually go on the surface of Mars. You've got to have protection from harmful radiation. So a part of it they might even bury into the ground, and there's a rover on there as well. You then take off, leaving that Mars habitat unit behind. So the good thing about it is that you've now set up some infrastructure for the next explorers. So each time you go, you're building up infrastructure. Return trip to Earth, though, you get into the Earth return vehicle, and that propulsion stage of the Earth return vehicle would be used as the artificial gravity to get it to give you some artificial gravity for the trip back. And then every couple of years you would send new crew and all the time you'd be sending these Earth return vehicles so that you had sort of a redundant systems
Backup.
dotted around, in the same way that Mark Watney in The Martian had to go a very long distance to a redundant vehicle.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, one of the great things about Mars is it's a lot easier to take off. It's a bit like the moon. It's way easier to get out the gravity well, which is, it's like if only Earth was just a little bit smaller.
We're in the wrong planet.
We are on the wrong planet, yeah. If Mars had somehow flourished into life, then we'd be very much a spacefaring species by now.
Or we would have been already conquered by the Martians.
Oh, yeah, that is true. Ouch. So, Julio, shall we... we've got an announcement, haven't we, for the British Interplanetary Society?
Indeed.
So, yes, we've got Chris Welch, who, Julio, you've been taught by. Is that right?
No, actually, he arrived to ISU after I graduated from ISU.
Oh, okay.
But because I'm quite active with the alumni community and I was in the board of trustees of the university, and I just visit campus whenever I'm in the area. So I go to see him. Yeah. And I had some really amazing and inspiring conversations with Chris over the years. I thought, well, since he has an announcement to make and you don't want me to spoil it, and I remembered that this podcast is connected to the British Interplanetary Society in more ways than one. Well, let's hear from Chris.
Yes, a doctor of spacecraft engineering, no less, from Cranfield. So here,
and amongst other things, director of the International Space University Masters in Space Studies.
Yeah, if you want to look at Chris's CV, go to the ISU and look at his CV. I don't think I've ever seen anything quite like it. It's unbelievable.
Well, if we double the time of this podcast,
we could just about read them all out. So, and he's received the Sir Arthur Clarke Award for Space Education. So there we go. So yes, let's cut to it.
Hey, Cootie, the Interplanetary Podcast is alive!
We're joined on the podcast, myself and Julio, by Chris Welch from the International Space University, who's just... I'll let Chris say what the announcement was, but welcome to the podcast, Chris.
Okay, thank you very much. Good to be here with both of you online. Yes, the announcement earlier this week, the British Interplanetary Society, of which I have been a member since 1979. I joined in my first year as an undergraduate student. Announced that I am now the President-Elect. There was an election, and I'm very, very lucky, very honoured, very pleased and proud to be the incoming president for the British Interplanetary Society. I'll take up office in August, so I have a bit of time to get used to the idea before I do that, and that will be for a 3-year term. So another nice thing about it, if I've done my sums correctly, is that I will be the president when we have our 90th anniversary, because we were founded in 1933. The British Interplanetary Society is proud of saying that the world's oldest, still existing space advocacy organization. There were other societies formed back in the 30s, but they have either merged with other entities to create new bodies, or they have died. The BIS was also one of the founders of the International Astronautical Federation, and there were 13 organizations that founded that, and again the BIS is the only one that is still around. So I will still be alive when we hit our centenary in 2033, but in the meantime the 90th anniversary in 2023 will be, I hope, a wonderful celebration.
Well, that's quite a resilient organization. What do you think is the secret to it?
I think the secret to the BIS's resilience is just the energy, enthusiasm, and commitment of all the people involved, whether it's the staff who actually work for the organization, or the members, or the people who serve on council, or the numerous volunteers without which we could not deliver what we deliver. And it's just this overall commitment for passion for space. That's really what it comes down to.
So you're based in Strasbourg, so presumably you're the first remote president?
Indeed, yes. And I had, I used to live in southwest London until 10 years ago, just down the railway line from the British Interplanetary Society, and it would have been really a lot more sensible to maybe to be president when I lived in London. But I did give a lot of thought to whether that was a good idea. Certainly when I first moved over to Strasbourg to take up the job at the International Space University, I thought it was going to be too difficult. But I guess it's another one of these things that's a side effect of the pandemic, which is over the last year, we've all had to learn to get much better at using online tools. And certainly if I've managed to run, an entire MSc in space studies for the last year with, remote classes, remote students, remote lecturers, I'm confident that the same can happen with the BIS.
Have you got a favourite previous president? There are some particularly famous.
Yes, well, Arthur C. Clarke has to be my favourite, past president, because he was Arthur C. Clarke. Damn it, I mean, when I was a child, I grew up reading science fiction, and this was back in the 70s, really. And at that point, the big three science fiction writers were Asimov, Heinlein, and Clarke. And Clarke was the British one. And as well as writing science fiction, he also, wrote books on space travel. And somewhere at some point, I got this slim volume on space travel in a secondhand bookshop somewhere. And that was where I first started to get into, orbit mechanics and rocket propulsion and so on. And then, of course, there was the science fiction books. He was his role as a futurist, and of course 2001 as a Space Odyssey. I mean, I was 8 or 9 when that came out, so I didn't see it immediately, but then I don't recall just how old I was. I was probably about 14 or 15 when I did see that, and that was such a powerful vision of the future of space travel because of the amazing special effects, plus a kind of wonderful sort of millennium spanning narrative, even if the end of it was a bit freaky and difficult to understand. But it was just such a wonderful film. And as I say, I became aware of the British Interplanetary Society, and then joined when I was a student, and that was how I got most of my space information in those days. The Space Flight magazine came out once a month, and that told you everything you needed to know about space. Nowadays, you just look on your smartphone and it's all there, which is actually a challenge for the small space societies such as the BIS and other ones globally, because in the past people joined because they wanted to find out about space. Now they don't need to join to find out about space. In fact, there's so much content that you can't possibly, consume it all. And so I think part of the challenge for the BIS is working out, how to provide what members and potential members want. And so certainly I expect, as president, to have an increasing focus on students and young professionals, trying to improve the demographic of the BIS, build the membership numbers, develop new networks, because the world is much more complicated than it was in 1933. In 1933, the BIS was those cranks, those nutcases who thought that space travel was possible. Now it's, well, yes, everybody knows it's possible and you can make a lot of money from it. The BIS is still doing its speculative work. Its motto is from imagination to reality. And, it has its famous copies of the Journal of the British Interplanetary Society. My favourites were always the ones on interstellar travel. When I was younger, in those days they were famous for having the red covers. The normal ones were blue and the interstellar ones were red. And I still have all my red copies of JBIS. And that idea of doing the speculative stuff continues. There are many organizations in the UK and globally who look at space, and some of them have an industrial focus and some of them have a kind of Earth applications focus, but I think there has to be a place where there are people doing the really forward-looking stuff, and the BIS has its technical projects, and I hope those will also continue to develop to examine all those concepts that people think are crazy now, but in 10, 20, 30, 50 years, people will go, yeah, well, it's obvious that was a good idea.
One example of that is the nuclear propulsion between here and Mars, isn't it? Because that I think that was the first ever published paper was in JBIS about nuclear propulsion.
That's interesting.
In space.
I didn't know that. But
I think it was.
but it certainly wouldn't surprise me because another person who was involved with the British Interplanetary Society who wrote fiction was Patrick Moore, the astronomer. And I remember reading, he had a whole series of Mars-related kind of adolescent science fiction books. And in all those, the rockets that went to and from Mars were nuclear. And so, yes, nuclear propulsion was focused on very early on. And it's interesting to see how it kind of comes and goes. And just at the moment in the US, it's undergoing, definitely an upswing. There's more interest in it. Not so much in Europe at the moment. And again, the Russians, always difficult to know just what the Russians are doing. But there's some signs that there's more interest in Russian propulsion, in nuclear propulsion in Russia.
Presumably, there's a little bit of a tradition of nuclear propulsion, particularly at JBIS. If you think about people like Val Cleaver and Alan Bond and all those people that talk about nuclear propulsion.
Oh, yes. And in fact, at the International Space University on our master's program, we're shortly going to be redoing an elective, a short 2-week kind of module for our students on interstellar travel, in this case, particularly on world ship design, which we're doing with our friends from the Initiative for Interstellar Studies, which again is kind of linked into the BIS. Most of the people who are members of I4S are also members of BIS, and there's a lot of collaboration on projects, and certainly all the propulsion systems that you would need for a world ship. It's basically nuclear fusion. So otherwise, the only other way to do it is large sails and humongous great lasers, in the kind of Robert Forward tradition. But if you want an independently propelled, starship that travels at sublight speeds, yes, it's really got to be nuclear propulsion and fusion propulsion.
And you mentioned the young professionals, youth, students, the technical projects. You used to be already on the outreach committee, right?
I'm on the BIS Education and Outreach.
Okay. You remain there, or as a president, you?
Yes. No, okay. I will stay on that. I mean, space education and outreach has been one of my things for all my all my career. I used to have an organization called the Space Education Council in the UK that ran for about 10 years, which was a sort of if you like, a kind of trade body for groups, organizations, and people interested in space education and outreach. And I was chair of UK SEDS many decades ago, when my hair was the color that yours is now, rather than being the white that it is.
I mean, mine or Matt's.
I was going to say we got snap on the hair.
Yes.
So I what I wanted to ask you is, so you mentioned these projects. Do you have any during these 3 years? Do you have any other particular objective in mind, that you want to accomplish?
Well, beyond the technical, building the technical projects. Well, I think the things we need more members. I've already mentioned that's a problem for all the small traditional space societies in the world. So we need more members. We need younger members. We need, I think, to boost our technical projects. I think we need to boost our communication and outreach to the broader community, and then lastly, another personal interest of mine, and I have to say I've no idea. I haven't. You're hearing this first, so I've no idea what the rest of the BIS and the council are. I'm also very interested in space and culture. Art, music, the non-scientific, non-technical side of space. I have a poem on the International Space Station at the moment. It's been up there for almost 1,000 days. We should get that back in January. And I know a whole bunch of space artists, and I'm keen, if possible, to get the BIS to throw its net even wider than it does at the moment, and to try and engage with that community in some way. Maybe it'll be in the form of just some lectures from artists. I mean, there's an artist based in London, an Irish artist, Aoife, and she was an artist in residence at ESTEC a couple of years ago, and so she has some interesting perspectives. But there's a whole bunch of of other space-related artists in all sorts of media, and I don't think people largely know they exist. The space community itself, but also the public. They're sort of working on this stuff because they find it interesting, but it's difficult for them to intersect, to get the visibility. And I think I would like the BIS, if it can, to champion them. But of course, this always depends on resources.
Well, funnily enough, I mean, we next week. I've just done an interview with a couple of artists who've done the Mars House in Bristol. I don't know if you know about that project.
I've heard of it, but I don't know about it.
Yeah, it's really fascinating because one of the great things is they've got a team of architects that did the Antarctic buildings.
Yes,
but they're kind of leaving it open, and so that it's much more the people's response to the actual inside space that sort of grows the space. And I think it is really important. I think artistic perspectives on things are incredibly important, particularly when it comes to if we're ever going to live on Mars. But I do exactly the same thing. We sometimes have musicians, we sometimes have artists, and we sometimes we talk about music all the time, because I think there's a massive space music connection. And I think I must be the only person that's done a gig with a band in the BIS Arthur C. Clarke House.
Excellent. Well, yeah. so that'll be another thing. I will publicly sign up to now that we are going to have at least one gig at Arthur C. Clarke House during my time as president. I don't know what it'll be or how, but we will do that.
Well, I'll tell you what, for the 250th, is it going to be, the 250th episode, or maybe the 300th episode of the podcast, because it was the 100th episode of the podcast, we did a live gig there. So please have us back, Chris.
Well, tell me the date, of the,
Yeah, well, this is episode 228, so I guess it's probably too soon for 250, but for 300, we'd be, I don't know, 70 weeks away or something like that. So what's that? That's a year and a half.
We can do that.
We should be all vaccinated by then, right?
And particularly because the BIS's motto again is from imagination to reality, and really all of the really interesting projects I've been involved in my life have come up through imagination and conversations like this one, and then you get into the planning and implementation phase, and then you have committees and all the rest of it. But in my experience, the good ideas tend to come up in social settings, And if you look back at the early pictures of the BIS from the 1930s, the meetings are all in pubs, it's, and I would love to know, how many rockets were designed on the back of beer mats, during those meetings. So pubs, coffee houses, informal conversations, the interchange between people. That's where the ideas come from, and then you set up the formal apparatus for making them happen. I think so. And it's that first imagination stage that makes the new things happen.
I personally can't wait to get back to that. I remember some good conversations around the International Astronautical Federation with you in bars as well.
So
can't
absolutely.
wait to get that back.
Yeah.
Well, now that you mentioned this part on culture and art, of course, this podcast has a certain history with the BIS, I guess.
Yeah, it does.
Maybe you can explain a little bit more. But yeah, I think if there is any way that we can help on that objective that you have, I would be more than happy to pitch in.
Excellent. That would be great. So it's only been a few days, since I got the announcement that I'm going to be president. So I haven't really had time to think of a quotes presidential agenda unquotes, which all sounds a bit kind of as if I've got delusions of adequacy. But I will bear that in mind, because over the coming months I need to think about what I would like the BIS to do. To be clear, the president of the BIS is not somebody with kind of a massive amount of power. It's not like there are no BIS executive orders that I can sign to say make this happen. It's all got to be agreed by the BIS Council. But I'm hoping that in my role as president, I can sort of, promote some new initiatives and lead the BIS in a direction that I think is essential for it to go. So yes, I think we have the Interplanetary podcast, we have the British Interplanetary Society, we have the history, which I will let Matt explain in a second, because I was on council when the idea came up, and I remember going, yes, that's a good idea, but I wasn't. That was the sum of my involvement, was going, yes, tick, good idea.
That was actually before my time, so I would love to hear a little bit more about that.
So Matt, it's my turn to interview you now, Matt. So how did this happen?
It happened because I actually applied for a job at the BIS, and I got down to the final 3, and then had a job interview with you, Chris, and a few others, and I didn't make the final cut. So, but I thought I really still wanted to do something for the BIS because I was really enthusiastic about it, and so I started doing the podcast, and it was quite funny because it's a mix, isn't it? It's a mix of hardcore rocket scientists and space enthusiasts. I think, a lot of people came on side, and obviously David Baker started having regular slots on the show and doing stuff, and I ended up writing a few things for the Space Flight magazine and stuff like that. So it's been a really good mutual relationship, obviously something that I'm super proud of, just because of the connection to things like Arthur C. Clarke. And I think I don't think I've met a person since doing like all these interviews who doesn't say that sci-fi wasn't their route into doing it. Virtually everyone was just like, particularly my age, it was Arthur C. Clarke and things like that. And then later it's Star Wars and Star Trek. And then later it's The Expanse. And then it's all, and you think, sci-fi is just unbelievably important. And I think the BIS have been really influential on sci-fi as well.
Yeah, no, I agree. There's been a lot of, interchange between the two.
So that's the history, Julio.
I'm happy things worked out the way they did. If there is any way that we can support you and help you on this, count me in.
Absolutely. No, that sounds like an excellent plan to me. So we'll find a way to make this happen.
By the way, Chris, will there be any, since you wear all these hats with these different organizations, any new ways of connecting the ISU with the BIS, with the IAF? I will stop saying acronyms now. Yeah,
well, I will certainly be trying to do this. I'm always looking for new ways of doing this sort of thing, and certainly, I mean, the BIS was one of the founder members of the IAF, but of course the space societies are now entirely dwarfed by the space agencies and the big space companies. But
and Arthur C. Clarke was essential for the inauguration, for the foundation of ISU as well.
But one of the things that I'm particularly pleased about was that when I was a vice president of the IAF for 3 years, from 2015 to 2018, and it was the BIS which nominated me. And many of the nominations for vice presidents come from space agencies and companies and big organizations. So I was really pleased to be there, partly as a kind of representative of the BIS and the small societies, and the ones that initially set up the federation. So I'm always keen to remind the federation of its roots when I get the opportunity. And I'm still on multiple IAF committees as the immediate preceding Vice President for Education and Workforce Development, which was what my role was. I'm on something called the Next Generation Coordination Committee, because actually the IAF now has so many different groups doing things related to education, outreach, and young people and young professionals, that we had to set up a committee to enable all these groups to talk to each other. And ISU is part of I also sit on that committee by being somebody from ISU, as well, and so there's that sort of cross connection, and then I'm already sort of trying to build stronger links between ISU and the BIS. We had some in the past when we used to have a symposium at ISU. We tried to get the papers from the symposium published in JBIS. Or a selection of them. Unfortunately, we had to stop doing the symposium a few years ago, but there's that possibility as well. I'm hoping that some of the papers that some of my students do might end up in JBIS. And I've got one or two other ideas that I'm not going to talk about on the podcast now, because
too soon.
You gave us an answer.
A little bit too soon, but yeah, I have some ideas, but I need to sort of talk to some people first before I go public on those. One of my enduring pleasures, in life is finding two people or two organizations or a combination that I think could potentially have some synergy, and bringing them together and seeing, new things happen as a result. Sometimes it's introducing one person to another, sometimes it's, bringing two organizations together. And certainly since I'm at ISU and, will be president of the BIS, I would be hoping for some sort of closer cooperation.
Chris, thank you for giving us your time today. Much appreciated.
You're listening to the Interplanetary podcast, putting the ace back into space.
There we go. I enjoyed that interview. A lot. We'll definitely get Chris back on. President-Elect, new management for the BIS. Yep. You're a member, right? Yeah, I'm a member. I'm a fellow of the British Interplanetary. Yeah. Get that? I'm not. I have no relationship, except this podcast. There's something. We should do something about it. Yeah, you should. Yeah. Do you accept only Brits? No, it's. There's even an Italian branch, for example. No, I was teasing you. Yeah, I think it would be interesting to have a look, especially with the new things that it will offer. Yeah. Well, I mean, Zubrin's a member. Jonathan McDowell's a member. Nice little group. Yeah, it's the oldest continually running space organization in the world. I think you should do more podcast recordings live there. Oh yeah, no, definitely. We definitely need to do another gig. I remember that one. I was not there. I just listened to it as the audience, and that was fun. Yeah. No, it's brilliant. There's a video. It's one of the ones we got on YouTube video as well. It's good, with some songs, Bowie covers. Did you know today's Pi Day, by the way? No. 14th of March, 3.14. Well, yeah, if you say it in the American way. Yeah, it's American Pie Day. American Pie Day. ESA don't have a Mars mission, human Mars mission at all. It's all about robots. Well, but that is normal, because ESA does not have its own human-capable rocket. We have astronauts, and ESA is very much focused on international collaboration.
right?
Yeah.
Remember, Matthias was even training with the Chinese. I would assume unless there is really a big change in the ambition of European governments, if European governments would have the political will to go for more human spaceflight, we are ready. We can do it. Okay, we have studies, but the realistic situation now is that normally you would get behind one of the existing architectures. Could be behind with the Americans. In fact, do you recall that I think it was for Matthias' interview that it was announced that ESA would have some astronauts going to the gateway? I would assume that then, yes, the work would be behind the diplomacy behind getting European astronauts on these Mars missions whenever they happen.
Well, let's face it.
Unless there is a big change in the priorities.
Let's face it. If there is a Mars mission announced after Artemis, because Artemis is supposed to be a Mars mission, it has Mars in the logo. And as Donald Trump said, the moon is part of Mars. And so it's, which I felt sorry for him because I know what he meant. Europe is definitely going to be part of that trip in the same way that it's part of Artemis, building the service module and building bits of the gateway, etc., etc.
Oh, for sure.
So,
for sure.
And so,
I mean, I'm not.
You'd expect to
want this to sound as an official statement from ESA or anything. I'm just.
I'm going to
expecting
push you into official statement. No, I'm only joking.
as a poor employee, I just expect that if the political will and the Americans, the Russians, the Chinese, I don't know, in 50 years, if in some science fiction books, the Kenyans are the ones that take over because they can launch from Mount Kilimanjaro. I assume we will be trying to do international collaboration with whoever is there.
Oh God.
It's really, if you think about it, for ESA, international collaboration is at its core.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
Every project we have, 90-something% of the projects we have are international collaborations between ESA member states, right?
So
to collaborate with the Chinese or the Americans is an extension of that.
So the next batch of European astronauts might be the ones stepping out of a Chinese or American spacecraft onto the surface of Mars.
When do you think the Mars landing happens?
I think the earliest we can hope for really is the late 30s, early 40s.
Yeah. I mean,
and that would be a risky mission.
For how many times we heard 2030? Every 10 years. Yes. So my money is on Von Braun for this. 2050. 2054.
2054. Yep.
So if we have astronauts being hired now, let's assuming they are in there, imagine that, okay, in the last selection, you had people more in their mid-30s, right? So I would guess that by the time we go to Mars, they would be retired.
Yeah, but that might be an advantage to be, say, in your 50s, because then the radiation risk isn't such a disaster.
But we're talking about 30 years from now.
Yeah, so if you're in your
35,
30s,
65.
Yeah, so you can get fit 60-year-olds.
But would you send 60-year-olds to Mars?
It might be that might be a clever thing to do, because it's someone that's where the radiation risk isn't as bad. Mm-hmm. They've obviously got lots of experience. So as long as they're still healthy, it might be a good thing to send someone of that age.
No, now that I'm 40, 60 doesn't sound so
exactly.
old
Now I'm 50. It certainly doesn't. I think that's why I'm pushing for it. Well, I think
so. Yeah. Okay, I like it. One of these next batch of astronauts could be the first European on Mars.
Yeah. Well, say if we go for my mid-40s, as in they land in say 44, then they'd definitely be all right, wouldn't they? They'd be like 50, 54, something like that, which is only a little bit older than Matthias and Tim Peake.
No, and in the mid-50s, I think it would be totally fine. Again, Paolo Nespoli. How old is Paolo Nespoli?
He's a bit older, isn't he? I think he's.
Yeah, but he was flying until not long ago.
Yeah, well, of course, John Glenn is the ultimate one, isn't he?
Yes, but that was a specific thing. Okay, that was a specific mission because it was him, and there was a big component of it was the age. But Paolo Nespoli, he's now 63, and he flew 2017.
John Glenn was 77 when he went up on the space.
Yeah, but again, it was a one-off. He was not an active astronaut at the time.
No.
Nespoli, he was 60 years old when he went to the ISS.
Wow, was he really?
Or at least almost either 59 or 60. We would have to do the calculation, but so we're talking about if you would send someone 60 years old into space. Europe did it already.
That's incredible.
Incredible.
That is amazing.
And this guy, Paolo Nespoli, at 60, had to land back on his Soyuz.
Man, yeah,
imagine the impact on your back.
Ouch.
I mean, I can only think of my back at 40. Imagine your back at 60. Of course, Paolo Nespoli is probably infinitely more fit than any of us.
Yeah, he's definitely fitter than me. Post-lockdown Matt, that's for certain. Right, talking of that, we better post-lockdown this podcast. So I've got a hope in hell of editing the goddamn thing.
Good thing we wanted to keep it to 40 minutes.
Good job we kept it short.
Yeah.
Woo! Well, I'm going to welcome the latest few people that have joined Patreon recently. Thanks very much for that. That's absolutely awesome. And the people that left reviews as on I called out for some reviews on iTunes and got some.
Well, I want to hear those reviews. Space podcasts don't get better than this. A perfect blend of friendly enthusiasm and nerdy details made accessible. Listeners can keep up to date on the latest space developments and then take a deep dive into perennial topics in the expert interviews. The hosts are very well informed and bring out the best from their interviewees.
Oh, that's good, isn't it? I've not read that one.
Oh. It's new. It's from Tyrell McAllister.
Good on you.
Killer podcast, covers a wide variety of space topics and has a ton of interesting guests.
It does make it all worth it, doesn't it? When you hear stuff like that.
I already have offered to them your service as recording messages for their answering machines.
Yeah, that was right. Didn't I have to send them a mug? I have to listen back to the episode.
I offer something intangible. You offer material objects.
Oh, no. Right, we got to have to wrap this up. People want to go and look at the show notes, of which I'm going to put loads this week. Where should they go, Julio?
They should go to interplanetary.org.uk.
Exactly. And if they want to be patrons, like a couple of people have this week, thank you so much, is patreon.com/interplanetary. And you can join the Discord and join all the Discordians, the Spodcats. And next week, one of the Spodcats is co-hosting with me, Rob. And it's all going to be about space architecture, and it's a very good one indeed.
Yeah, I can't wait to hear it.
No, I'm super looking. I love the Habitat ones. They're really good. So it'll form part of our Habitat playlist. Bye-bye, Spodcats!
Bye-bye.